Okay, so ecology. Ecology is kind of bringing together a larger scale of science. So rather looking at individuals or organisms or um, how they're classified or taxonomy, we're going to look at how organisms interact together. Okay, so and plants are at the basis of all ecological, um, not all ecological associations, but all ecosystems have to have plants or have to have autotrophs in there. So they're very important for the functioning of ecosystems. Now, ecology, what exactly that means? It's not the same as environmental science or um, even an ecosystem. Instead, it's the study of relationships of organisms to each other, so living things, and also their environment. And so there are non-living things in the environment and how it all functions together. Um, so an environment of each habitat is determined, like I said, between living and non-living or biotic and abiotic factors. All right, so a lot of the ecology is looking at populations, which are groups of individuals of the same species. So here we have a population of these blue flowers. I'm not sure what they are, but blue flowers at what looks like a high alpine ecosystem. And there are different ways to investigate populations. You can count the number of individuals and look at that over size. You can look at population density. You can look at density in relation to other things, or you can calculate just the biomass, the overall mass of a species or a community or an organism within an area. All right, so a plant community then is the unit, the number of plant species and how they interact within a given area. So all the species in the plants, looking at the different species within an area. So here we have a riparian plant community, one that is established at the interface between land and water. The biotic community includes other organisms that are also living, which aren't plants. Okay, so algae or vertebrates or insects or all those other things which are also interacting with plants. Within a region, a similar environment will have a similar species composition. However, each species is distributed according to their own responses to changes in physical and biotic environment. So each of them has a specific niche where they can use specific resources, and their interaction between other living things determines where they are. So a species composition of a community is determined by local availability of the species, by unique historical events, and sometimes just by chance. By chance, one species might establish over another. All right, so why is it important to study a plant community? It may be important to help make these vegetation maps. So this is going to help in what is important for the use of different types of land. If you want to put farms there, if you want to make forests there, if you want to preserve it for a national park or whatever, and also what natural resources might be there. That might include, mines or even timber or water. All those things plants have an effect on, and plants might be established there, or forests might be established there, which you might have to consider then what putting a mine will do for that area. Like I said, you might have a conservation area, a wildlife preserve, or maybe even a national forest or a park or something. Some areas also may be heavily polluted and not able to produce their original function, or you may just want to change their function back to its original ecosystem. So you may have landscape restoration where you're trying to go in and establish species to create an environment similar to those that are natural. And you can also analyze changes in vegetation over time, which would be looking at succession, which we'll talk about later, and infer the qualities of each environment based on those different species. So this is a GIS map where you can look at different an area, and you can look at um, what is in each type of area. So you'll have public and private land. You'll have areas being restored. You have, of course, this giant lake here. And they can get way more specific than this, including, I mean, this just says private land. That doesn't tell if it's a farm or if it's forest or what it might be. So global information systems using aerial maps or vegetation surveys or whatever can help also specify what is in these different areas. All right, so an ecosystem is a community, or not just a community, but all different types of animals living within a specific area, and then how they interact with each other and the biological and abiotic factors within them, including how different processes cycle nutrients and chemicals, including nitrogen, carbon, and carbon dioxide, and phosphorus. Whatever you can think of, there's some sort of cycling going on in their use. The distribution of a plant species in an ecosystem is controlled by temperature, precipitation, soil type, and effects of other organisms. And we've looked at how these different things can affect plants as well. And it may also be affected by the mineral content of soil, competition for resources, herbivory, dispersal by an animal community. So birds may be dispersers of specific seeds, and the pattern of available water, whether it's constant or goes through periods of drought, so on and so forth. So ecosystems may be sustained entirely through photosynthetic activity. So you don't really need animals. You just need autotrophs. But if you have photosynthetic activity, you also have flow of energy through the consuming of organisms, and also nutrient recycling. Producers then are those that photosynthesize, which include plants and algae. Then you have primary consumers. These are herbivores that eat on these producers, these plants. And then you have secondary consumers, which feed on the primary consumers, and decomposers, which help to break down organic material after things have died and wasted away. And these help to also reassimilate those back into the environment. So ecosystems include producers and consumers and their interactions. And we can diagram these forming what we call food chains or food webs. So it's usually a little more convoluted than just a simple line, a food chain. It's actually more like a food web because multiple animals eat many different things. But this can help us determine the flow of energy through different levels. So each trophic level, or each primary consumer to secondary consumer, those are two different trophic levels, or area in which you feed in a specific ecosystem. And at each point, you're going to lose energy between each trophic level because there's just not 100% efficiency. So you lose a lot through heat or through entropy. And it's about 10% is maintained through each level. So that means producers may produce 100 calories, or primary consumers only have 10 calories, and then secondary consumers only have 1 calorie from eating up and down the food chain. Well, this limits how many levels you can have, so it pretty much stops at tertiary. Maybe some areas will have 5 levels to them, or some ecosystems, but most of them are going to have very simple 3 or 4 steps. So plants interact between other plants. They also have to interact between herbivores and other organisms. And some of the things they do include allelopathy, which is the production of chemicals, which is going to inhibit other plants. So pine trees produce pine needles, which they regularly shed throughout the year. And these pine needles will prevent other things because they will change the acidity of the soil and prevent other things from growing. So that's an allelopathy. Phytoalexins are chemicals that kill or inhibit disease, fungi, or bacteria. So these are going to prevent infection or consumption by bacteria or fungi. Some bacteria limit plant growth by producing inhibitory compounds. So they can also have their own ways of competing with plants. Some plants do not produce chlorophyll, and so those have to depend on plant hosts for energy. So they are like parasitic plants. Plants do have mutualistic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, which we've talked about a few times. And some herbivores and plants are involved in coevolution, where plants will develop defenses against the herbivore, and the herbivore will counteract that with a way to get around the defense. All right, so one of the ways we can characterize different plants is by their life histories. And life histories are the characteristics in which it controls their survival and reproduction, or their fitness. So some of these include Big Bang production, and they devote all their resources to growth for most of their life until favorable conditions, and then they spend all their energy in producing seeds at that point. So an example of this are the desert agave plants. These will generally only bloom once every 7 or 8 years, some even longer than that. But this is the flowering stalk. Normally you just have this kind of large succulent leaves, similar to a cactus, but not as spiny. And then the year in reproduction, they just spend all this energy into this reproductive flowers and seeds. You can have repeated production, which is where plants will produce seeds throughout their lifetime. So most trees are like this maple tree, or these coniferous trees behind here. Annuals will just kind of avoid it altogether just by doing everything in 1 year, so they have one season. Biennials grow for 1 year and then reproduce in the second year, and then they die after that. Perennials produce vegetative structures that survive for many years. Okay, so there's lots of different methods for survival and reproduction. These are also described in functional terms. So if you're in a habitat with low stress and little disturbance, that environment will select for traits that confer a competitive advantage for large, persistent, fast-growing, slow to reproduce organisms. So this is kind of seen on this little diagram here as well. Okay, if you're in habitats with high stress but little disturbance, high stress, little disturbance, and select for stress tolerance, then you'll have small, slow-growing, limited reproductive ability, but they don't respond to nutrients because the stress is too high. And then if you have habitats with low stress, substantial disturbance, these select for weedy traits, which are fast-growing, small, annual, reproduce quickly. Okay, so that would be over here. All right, phenology then is the looking at these different events within a life history of a plant. So these include germination, bud burst, flowering, seed production. And in seasonal areas, you may see this within the 4 seasons. And they are affected by photoperiod, temperature, light quality, other things which help to germinate seeds or help to produce flowers and so far, and other things in their phenology. The growth rates are controlled mostly by moisture and temperature, and these seem to be shifting with global warming. So one of the effects is, as it's warmer, these things will happen earlier in the spring or later in the fall. But generally everything happens earlier because the seeding, it depends on the flowering, which depends on pollination. So other organisms have to adjust seasonally as well. All right, so now we're going to talk about a few different cycles. The first one is water cycle. Okay, so this is how water, cycles through ecosystems. Most water is in oceans, rivers, and lakes. Some of it is frozen in ice and evaporated in the air as water vapor, or in glaciers. Some of it is also trapped in the soil. Rainfall will then cause it to come out of water vapor and start it to go onto land. Then it will generally go lower and lower as through the effects of gravity and run off into the ocean or be trapped in lakes. Heat from the sun causes evaporation, so more of that then just goes back into the atmosphere. It also helps to cause evapotranspiration in plants, which causes, again, more water vapor to be in the air. This is disrupted by humans, though. We use a lot of water for whatever we want, so we'll take water out of the ground. We'll create reservoirs by damming things, so we're disrupting the natural flow of water. And then global warming will cause, if temperature is higher, then you will cause an increase in evaporation and a decrease in the amount of water trapped in ice and glaciers and other things. So here's the figure we'll use in class, which goes through all the different processes we just talked about. So that's the water cycle. We have another one called the carbon cycle, and this is mostly through carbon dioxide, which is then trapped by photosynthesis into organic materials or living organisms. So carbon dioxide isn't like a major constituent of the atmosphere, only 0.3% of the atmosphere. So quite not very much, but there's enough to power photosynthesis. Respiration from all living things replaces carbon dioxide. So as we break down sugars or whatever we're using for energy, we give off carbon dioxide. 90% of that is probably by decomposers such as bacteria and fungi. Fossil fuels is organic matter that has been through millions of years of pressure and heat turned into hydrocarbons. And when we burn those, that also increases the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. If you have more carbon dioxide, that may be great for C3 plants, but not for C4 plants, so it doesn't really help them. So it might give a competitive advantage to C3 plants and decrease an advantage of C4 crops, or we might just have to grow them more in northern latitudes. The increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere also is causing more to be dissolved into the ocean. The ocean acts as a sink for carbon dioxide. And that acidification then can reduce the shell thickness of calcium carbonate is what most shells are made out of by invertebrates in the ocean, and the acidification of the ocean can cause those to dissolve. So here's the carbon cycle. We'll go over this in class. There's also the nitrogen cycle. So this one's a little harder to do. It requires organisms to be able to get all the nitrogen out of the air. So most of the air is actually nitrogen gas. But it's unavailable to us unless you have a process for converting it into an organic compound such as ammonia. And so this occurs through mutual associations with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, including in nodules, which we've talked about before, root associations. You can also recycle nitrogen as it's passed through urine, feces, or in dead things as well. So this is what the nitrogen cycle looks like. Sometimes you can have too much nitrogen. So we can actually run electricity through air and create ammonia, and then use that to make an artificial fertilizer. But if you just add a bunch of artificial fertilizer and no organic material with it onto your land, that can increase the amount of nitrogen runoff, and it acts as a pollution. This can also affect your soil and make your soil hardened, because you need to have a constant increase in organic material to, increase your soil. Otherwise, you will deplete it. Okay. All right. So now we're switching topics. We're going to succession. Succession is where you have basically a giant disturbance which, wipes everything out. Okay. And initially, there are little to no signs of life, like after a fire or drought or something. But after ecosystem services return, like you get rain, or over the course of a few seasons, you will start to see new organisms colonizing the area. So that would be like the first steps of succession. These in turn will create soil or different compositions within the ecosystem, and then you will have a different set of plants going on and colonizing and replacing the first set of plants that was in there. So this is called enhancement of species, and as long as you have a disturbance, kind of regular disturbance coming through the area, this can help to increase diversity. So there are two different types of succession. Primary succession is when there is nothing left. There's no soil or anything, or you have the establishment of new land, such as with volcanoes. And now you're starting without soil at all. And so you have little plants like ferns and mosses, and lichens, which can actually establish on bare rock. Or these ferns can also establish within the cracks of this lava and start growing. There are, like I said, lichens, mosses, and some ferns which can grow on these bare rocks. Eventually, though, however, they will create more and more biomass until it accumulates into a soil type, which will then allow other plants to grow on top of it and outcompete them. And those will then be outcompeted by grasses, which will be outcompeted by shrubs, and then trees, and then eventually, depending on the area, you'll have hardwood trees or coniferous forest, which will be the climax community, or the community at which there is no stage afterwards. In the climax community, those organisms outcompete all other organisms as long as there isn't a disturbance. So succession then is, this disturbance event, which then leads to different establishment of species over time, and it can take a long time till you get to a climax community after it has gone through a number of pioneer and intermediate species. Secondary succession then is where you have the removal of all the plants and organisms, but you still have the soil there. So it's takes less time to get to a climax community in secondary succession than in primary succession. Fires are a natural occurrence of events which happens in many forests, which is a disturbance which starts the succession all over again. Humans have changed the fire regime to where now they don't occur as frequently, and when they do occur, they are more intense. And if they're too intense, they can disturb things too intensely. The fire can burn too hot, and then this will mess up the ecosystem dynamics. If they occur too frequently, the same thing can happen, but on the opposite spectrum, where you have too many of these primary species and not enough of the later species of the climax communities. So fire benefits grasslands, especially. They'll have generally frequent fires, and the grasses will then grow back quite readily after a fire. So they're more adapted to withstand those disturbance events of fire. But since we've suppressed fire in the grasslands in the North America, you're getting a lot more of these shrubby species. So one of the things people have done is to go in and do prescribed fires or prescribed burns. Well, they'll go in and they'll burn an area and make sure that it doesn't get out of control. And that helps to restore the ecosystem back to how it originally was before humans got there.